Story 1. My name is John, and my story isn't easy to tell. In fact, I never thought I'd experience something so bizarre and terrifying in a life as ordinary as mine. Maybe it's best to start from the beginning so you can understand how things got to this point. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. I never had many ambitions in life. My dad was a bricklayer, and my mom worked as a cleaner. When I was younger, I never imagined I'd end up doing something so lonely and strange as collecting scrap metal. But life sometimes pushes you into unexpected places. At 18, I lost my dad to a sudden illness, and my mom, consumed by grief, was never the same again. With bills piling up, I had to drop out of school and start working. I tried several things, but nothing seemed to work out. That's when I started working at the local junkyard, a simple job, sorting metals, parts, anything that could be recycled. It seemed easy at first, but the night shifts, the loneliness, and the darkness ended up shaping me in ways I didn't expect. I ended up taking the night shift as a scrap collector on the streets because no one else wanted it. It was a dirty job, but it paid enough to keep my mom and me going. I didn't expect anything more from life. Before we continue with more terror stories, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button if you're enjoying the content. Your interaction is crucial for us to keep uncovering mysteries that challenge our reality. Don't forget to comment below with the name of the city you're watching from so we can see how far our stories have reached. The first few weeks were calm, almost comforting. The night had always been my companion. I'd drive my old van, a rusty relic my dad had left me, and pick up anything the residents left on the curbs. I enjoyed that silence, the solitude, just me, the engine quietly humming, and the empty streets surrounding me. It was on one of those quiet nights that things began to change. One day, I received a pickup request from an old street in town. I had passed by there a few times, but that area always gave me the creeps. The houses were old, some seemed abandoned, with dusty windows and overgrown gardens. Still, work was work. So I went. At first, everything seemed normal. I picked up bags of scrap and tossed them into the van. But something started to bother me. Among the trash bags, strange objects began to appear. Old dolls, those porcelain ones with cold eyes that seemed to follow you. Clothes from another era, clothes my grandmother might have worn. Black and white photographs, yellowed by time, showing people who looked sad, empty. It was like I was unearthing pieces of a past that no one wanted to remember. These objects didn't seem like ordinary trash, and the feeling that something was wrong kept growing. I tried to ignore it. Even when I found those heavier, different trash bags, I kept doing my job. Until one night, I decided to open one of those bags to see what was inside. And that's when everything fell apart. Inside that bag, among the old dolls and clothes, was a book. An old book, with worn pages and a cover that was almost disintegrating. But what made me freeze was what was written on the cover, my name. Yes, there it was, in large, faded letters. And right below, a date. A date that paralyzed me, the next day. I didn't know what to do. I closed the bag, threw everything back into the van, and tried to forget. But something inside me knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. A message from someone or something that knew more about me than I did. The next night, I was already tense before I even left the house. I knew I'd have to go back to that street. The van, my companion for so many nights, now felt like a coffin on wheels. When I arrived on that street, the air felt heavier, like something was watching me, waiting for me. I started collecting the scrap, but all my senses were on high alert. Everything felt wrong. That's when it happened. I heard a sound. A whisper, coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My name. John. Like the wind was calling me. I looked around, but the street was deserted. I ran to the van, but something even more terrifying awaited me. The passenger door, which I was sure had been closed, was slightly ajar. Inside, on the passenger seat, was the book I had left in the trash bag the night before. My heart nearly stopped. I hadn't brought that book with me. And now it was there open, with the page turned to that day's date. But the worst was yet to come. Underneath the book was a photo. An old black and white photo showing a man next to a van. A man who looked like me. I couldn't breathe. How was that possible? I picked up the photo with trembling hands, and when I turned it over, I saw something handwritten. He knew he shouldn't have returned. At that moment, the streetlights began to flicker, and the van's engine started by itself. The roar of the engine in the silence of the night made my blood run cold. My legs were paralyzed, unable to move. The engine abruptly shut off, and the silence returned. But I knew I wasn't alone. Something or someone was there with me. I dropped the photo and the book on the seat, shut the van's door, and got out of there as fast as I could. My heart wouldn't stop racing as I drove back home. That night, I didn't sleep. I knew something was wrong, that street, those objects, and that van were somehow connected to something much bigger than I could understand. The next day, I went to the junkyard and asked for a transfer. I said the night shift wasn't doing me any good. I didn't tell anyone what had really happened. Who would believe me? I never went back to that street, but something inside me knew it wasn't over. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, I still hear that whisper, "John." It's like the night is calling me back to something I never wanted to discover. And even though I know I'll never return, part of me feels that one day I'll be forced to face whatever had been waiting for me on that old, abandoned street. Because somehow, I know it's still watching me. And the story isn't over yet. Story 2. My name is Paolo, and to this day, no matter how hard I try, I've never been able to forget the terrifying nights I experienced at that gas station. I was just an ordinary gas station attendant, working along a deserted road in the countryside of Sao Paulo. Back then, the night shift was always the calmest. Late into the night, it was just me and the silence. I never imagined that my job, which had been so monotonous, could turn into a true nightmare. It all started one early morning, around 3 a.m. The clock had already struck its silent chimes, and the station was completely empty. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of a distant engine. I looked down the road and saw headlights approaching in the distance. At first, it wasn't unusual, but as soon as the car pulled into the station, I felt something strange in the air. It was a black Maverick, one of those old ones with faded matte paint, almost as if the car was a solid shadow moving across the asphalt. The windows were so dark that you couldn't see anything inside. It stopped in front of the pump, and as usual, I approached to fill the tank. But something wasn't right. When I started pumping the gas, I noticed that the fuel was going in way too slowly, much slower than usual. The tank seemed bottomless, like it would never fill up completely. I looked inside the car, expecting to see something, but the windows remained impenetrable. Then suddenly, the driver's window rolled down just a crack, enough for a pale, thin hand to emerge, holding the money. Not a word was spoken. The silence of that moment was deafening, as if the whole world around me had come to a halt. I took the money, and the Maverick pulled away, gliding down the road again, until it disappeared into the darkness. That first time, I tried to brush off what I felt. I convinced myself it was just fatigue, that I was imagining things. But a week later, at the same time, the car returned. This time, I was more alert. The same black Maverick, the same strange behavior. The fuel entering slowly, the window opening just a crack, and that pale hand handing over the money without a word. The car seemed to emerge from the darkness and vanish the same way. Weeks passed, and every time the clock struck 3 a.m., I knew the car would appear. I began to sense a presence in the air, as if the Maverick itself carried something bad with it. The air felt heavier, and the silence was no longer the same. It was as if something invisible was watching me from inside that car, even though I couldn't see anything beyond those dark windows. Then my curiosity, or maybe my fear, began to grow. The next time the Maverick showed up, I decided I needed to see who was driving. When it stopped at the pump, instead of just refueling, I tried to start a conversation. "Good evening, everything okay?" I asked, hoping for any kind of response. But silence was all I received. The window opened that same minimal crack, and the same white hand handed me the money. I was determined to see who or what was inside that car. I moved closer to the window, trying to peek in. My heart was racing, but I saw nothing. Nothing except my own distorted reflection in the glass. The Maverick pulled away, as always, silently, disappearing into the darkness. That night, I knew I wasn't dealing with something ordinary. Something inside me screamed that this wasn't just a mysterious driver. There was something deeper, darker. That's when I decided to tell the story to a highway patrol officer who regularly stopped at the station. "Almeida, there's a car that shows up here every week, at 3 a.m. It's a black Maverick, and there's something not right about it," I said, expecting him to laugh or tell me I was overreacting. But Almeida looked at me seriously. "I don't remember seeing a Maverick around here. Want me to take a look? Write down the plate number next time and give me a call." The following week, the car returned, as always. I wrote down the plate number and called Almeida. What happened next was the first big shock. "Paulo, the plate doesn't exist in the system. There's no record of that car. Nothing." His voice was grave on the other end of the line. I knew then that it was real, that it wasn't just in my head. Things started to get worse. Every time the black Maverick appeared, the entire station seemed to change. The lights would dim, as if being swallowed by the surrounding darkness. The silence grew heavier, almost tangible. And then one night, when the car stopped, I felt something different. The air around me turned cold, and my breath started to falter. When I approached to refuel, I saw that the tank seemed dark. There was no visible bottom, as if the fuel was disappearing into something beyond comprehension. This time, I decided to check the security cameras. But when I reviewed the footage, the Maverick wasn't there. It was as if it had never been at the station. The cameras captured the empty night, as if I had refueled a ghost's car. Weeks passed, and my sanity began to unravel. Every time I saw those headlights on the road, my whole body would tense up. The fear was with me all the time now. Even during the day, I felt like the car was watching me, waiting for the time to return. Then one early morning, the black Maverick appeared again. But this time, something was different. The silence wasn't the same. There was a feeling of death in the air, as if I was walking into a trap. The car stopped at the pump, and as I approached, I noticed something that left me frozen. The window was fully open. For a moment, I stood paralyzed, waiting to see the driver's face. But there was no one. Nothing. The driver's seat was empty. The car seemed to be alive on its own. That's when a chill ran down my spine, as if something was touching me, but I couldn't see it. Suddenly, the Maverick's engine roared, but the car didn't move. The sound grew louder, more deafening, as if the car was screaming at me. The station lights began to flicker, and the sense that something terrible was about to happen overwhelmed me. I ran to the convenience store, shut the door, and watched through the window. The Maverick was there idling, its lights flickering as if calling out to me. And then, without warning, the engine cut off. The lights went out, and everything returned to silence. But before I could breathe a sigh of relief, the last thing I saw was the reflection of a face in the glass door. A pale, distorted face that wasn't mine. Since that night, the Maverick has never returned. But I know it's still out there. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the clock strikes 3 a.m., I feel the air change, and I get the sense that it's watching me from somewhere. I don't know if it was real, if it was a warning, or if it was just a nightmare I'll never wake from. But one thing is for sure, I'll never look at the road the same way again. Because somewhere, the black Maverick still waits. Story 3. My name is Hans, and I'm a janitor at a large office building in the center of Berlin. It's not the job I dreamed of, but it pays the bills. I've been working the night shift for about 5 years, when the building is empty, quiet, and I can do my tasks without interruptions. At first, I thought that was a good thing, the tranquility. But today, that calm gives me chills. The story I'm about to tell is something that still haunts me, something I've never been able to forget, no matter how hard I've tried. It all started on a night like any other. I was cleaning the cubicles where the employees worked during the day when an unexpected sound broke the silence. It was the sound of a computer turning on. I looked at the nearest monitor and saw the light flickering. I thought it was strange since all the computers were always turned off when the last employee left. I figured it might have been an automatic update or some technical glitch, so I walked over and turned off the monitor. I continued my routine, but that uneasy feeling lingered. Something didn't feel right, like there was an invisible presence in the office. Over the weeks, the phenomenon repeated itself. Every time I passed by a particular desk, the computer would turn on. I started avoiding that part of the office, but the sound of the monitor lighting up continued to echo through the room, even when I was far away. One night, while I was cleaning the cubicles, the monitor at that same desk was on again, but this time there was something different on the screen. Distorted images, as if they were pictures of simple objects but from angles that made them look wrong. There was a discomfort in looking at those photos. It was as if something was slightly out of place, but in a way I couldn't describe. A growing sense of dread began to fill me. What disturbed me the most was when the images suddenly disappeared, and a message appeared on the screen, "Don't look back." My body froze. My first instinct was to look behind me, but something deep inside, a primal instinct, stopped me. I felt a presence, something or someone was behind me, but I couldn't see it. My eyes filled with tears of pure terror. I felt like a shadow was hovering over me, growing heavier and more suffocating with each passing second. My legs were frozen, as if my body had been paralyzed by fear. I took a deep breath, stepped forward without looking back, and turned off the monitor. I tried to convince myself everything was fine, that it was just a technical glitch, a cruel prank. But deep down, I knew it was just the beginning. In the following days, I started asking the employees about who used to work at that desk. That's when I found out about Marcus, the man who disappeared without a trace. He hadn't shown up at the office for a week, exactly when the phenomena started. The strangest part was that no one knew what had happened to him. The boss simply said Marcus had gone missing, and his car was found abandoned near a forest outside the city, with all his belongings inside. That discovery made my stomach churn. Could everything I was seeing be related to Marcus? That desk, the computer turning on by itself, the disturbing images. Was he trying to tell me something? Or was something trying to warn me to stay away? The nights became a constant torment. I avoided that corner of the office, but whenever I got close, the monitor would light up on its own. The messages, each more disturbing than the last, appeared on the screen. One night, the message was even more direct: "Get out while you can." Fear overwhelmed me. I decided it was time to request a transfer. The next day, I spoke with my supervisor, making up an excuse about personal issues, and asked to be transferred to another building. He agreed, but said it would take a few days. I had to endure a few more nights in the office. The following night, when I entered the building, I felt a sharp cold. The air was different, heavier, almost impossible to breathe. I walked slowly to the conference room, trying to avoid any eye contact with Marcus's desk. Everything seemed calm until I heard a familiar sound. The click of the monitor turning on. My nerves were on edge. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I walked over to the desk, and the monitor was on, as always, but it wasn't just the screen flickering. The monitor was showing a video. In the video, I saw what seemed to be someone walking through the office. The angle was strange, like the camera was recording from above, floating down the corridor. The lights were flickering, and in the background, a shadow moved quickly between the cubicles. My eyes widened, and before I could react, the screen froze on a single image. Marcus, standing in the middle of the hallway, his face pale, his eyes vacant, staring directly at the camera. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around and realized I was standing in the same hallway where the video showed Marcus. Suddenly, the lights above me started flickering, and I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. There was movement in the corner of my eye. Something quick, like a shadow running along the corridor. I spun around to look, but saw nothing. The silence was so heavy that my ears were ringing. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were stuck to the ground. Then the sound. A low noise, like the sound of keys being pressed. It was coming from the conference room. With my heart racing, I walked toward the sound, each step making my legs tremble. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar, and the sound of typing continued. I pushed the door open slowly and saw the computer was on. On the screen, there was only one message, repeated over and over: "He is here." Before I could process it, the monitor went dark, and the lights in the room went out as well. I was plunged into complete darkness, unable to see anything, only feeling a presence surrounding me. The sound of footsteps echoed in the room, coming from all directions. At that moment, I knew I needed to get out of there. I ran, tripping over chairs, not daring to look back. When I finally made it out of the room, the hallway lights were flickering violently. I ran to the building's exit, and as soon as I crossed the threshold, everything stopped. The silence returned, and the lights stopped flickering. The next day, I went to my supervisor's office and insisted on being transferred immediately. I didn't tell him what had happened. He would never believe me. Who would believe me? Even as I think about it now, I feel like I might be losing my mind. Now, working in another building, far from that cursed place, I still can't forget. Sometimes, when the air gets too cold or the lights flicker for no reason, I feel like something is still watching me, like it's not over. And every night when I close my eyes to sleep, the last thing I see is Marcus's face, pale and empty, staring at me as if waiting for me to come back. But I'm never going back. Story 4. My name is Lucas, and even now, I try to convince myself that what I experienced that night was just a product of my imagination. I'm a night porter at a residential building in the center of Hamburg. A simple job, without many complications. When you work the night shift, the most common things you deal with are silence and solitude, occasionally opening the door for a resident arriving late or receiving an off-hours delivery. It was nothing I couldn't handle. At least, not until what happened with the elevator. It all started subtly. One night, one of the residents, an elderly lady from the 5th floor, came down to the front desk visibly shaken. She told me something was wrong with the elevator. According to her, the elevator had taken her to the 9th floor, even though she hadn't pressed the button for that floor. She mentioned feeling a strange presence inside, but at the time, I thought it was just her imagination or perhaps a technical malfunction. The elevator went to a floor that doesn't exist, she muttered with an expression of pure discomfort. I tried not to laugh. I thought it was just her being confused, especially since the building only has 9 floors, and she was talking about something beyond that. In the days that followed, more reports started to surface. A young couple came to me, saying the elevator was going down on its own in the middle of the night, even when no one was calling it. They also mentioned seeing strange reflections in the mirror inside the elevator, as if there was something or someone in there with them, something that shouldn't be. I began to get intrigued, but I still believed there had to be a rational explanation. That's when I decided to investigate for myself. The next time the elevator descended on its own, I'd be ready to see it. And that same night, at 3 in the morning, the control panel began to flicker. The elevator lights were going crazy, going up and down without anyone using it. I looked at the security cameras and saw the elevator doors opening, empty, going from floor to floor as if it was carrying someone invisible. A chill ran down my spine. I decided I needed to see it with my own eyes. I grabbed the control panel key and called the elevator. When the doors opened, everything seemed normal, but the air inside was colder than usual. I hesitated for a moment, but I got in. I pressed the button for the top floor, the 9th. I was alone, but as the elevator ascended, the feeling that I wasn't kept growing, like something was in there with me, watching from the shadows. The panel lights started flickering again, and the elevator suddenly stopped between the 6th and 7th floors. My heart raced. I tried pressing the buttons again, but nothing worked. The doors opened, and in front of me was a completely dark corridor. It wasn't the floor I expected to be on. That floor wasn't supposed to exist. The corridor was deserted, the lights flickering weakly from the ceiling, casting shadows that danced on the walls. The silence was overwhelming, as if the entire building had been submerged in some kind of void. When I took a step out of the elevator, I heard a low sound, like a distant whisper. It was barely audible, but there was no doubt it was there. Lucas. The voice called my name, echoing through the corridor. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, surrounded by a darkness that felt alive. With every step I took, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Panic started to rise within me, but something stopped me from turning back to the elevator. I felt like I had to understand what was happening. I kept walking down the corridor, and suddenly, I heard a loud snap, like the sound of a door slamming shut. I turned toward the noise and saw, just a few meters away, a hooded figure standing by one of the apartment doors. I couldn't see its face, but its eyes. Its eyes glowed in the darkness with a sinister, penetrating light. Frozen with fear, I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either, just stood there watching me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The voice echoed again, louder this time, "You shouldn't be here." That was enough to break the spell that held me in place. I spun on my heels and ran back toward the elevator. The doors were beginning to close, but I managed to throw myself inside just in time. I frantically pressed the button to go down, and the elevator finally responded, slowly moving downward. My heart was still pounding like a drum as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. As the elevator descended, the lights continued flickering, and I felt a presence beside me, even though I was alone. I looked at my reflection in the elevator mirror, and for a second, I swear I saw the hooded figure behind me, its eyes glowing with that damned light. When the elevator doors finally opened at the ground floor, I bolted toward the front desk. My hands were shaking so much I could barely grab the keys. What was that? A ghost? Some kind of entity? I didn't know. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. The next day, I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? A night porter talking about hooded figures and non-existent floors? But I decided I wasn't spending another night in that building. I went to my supervisor and resigned on the spot. I made up some excuse about family problems, but deep down, I knew I never wanted to step foot in that elevator again. Months have passed since that night, but the fear still follows me. Sometimes, when I'm home alone, I hear that whisper. Lucas. It's like whatever was on that floor followed me, like it's still waiting for me somewhere, on the edge of reality and the unknown. And so I go on trying to forget, but knowing it's still there. The elevator, the flickering lights, the glowing eyes, and the figure watching me from the shadows. Story 5. My name is Johann, and I work as an IT technician at a large company here in Frankfurt. It's not the kind of job that's usually exciting. Most of the time, I spend my days solving trivial problems, forgotten passwords, malfunctioning printers, dropped internet connections. It's always been a mechanical job, without much excitement. At least, until that night. The night everything changed. It was a typical Friday, late in the evening, and I was at home, finally relaxing after a long and tedious week. Suddenly, my phone rang. On the screen, my boss's name, Mr. Meyer, appeared. I already found it odd that he was calling me at that hour, but I answered. Johann, I need you to come to the office right now. One of the main computers is having problems, and I need you to fix it immediately. There was something strange in his voice. It was a mix of urgency and fear. I was confused. Normally, technical issues could wait until the next business day, but the way he spoke made it sound like an emergency. I sighed, and being a dutiful employee, I grabbed my jacket and went. When I arrived at the building, everything felt different. The night seemed darker than usual, and the air was heavy, almost oppressive. As I entered the office, I was greeted by an eerie silence, broken only by the echo of my footsteps in the empty hallways. I was used to working late, but this time there was something strange in the air, a sense that I wasn't alone, even though the building was completely deserted. I approached the room where the malfunctioning computer was located. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than usual, as if time and space were being distorted. When I reached the room, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the only sound was the faint hum of the monitor, as if it were waiting for me. I sat down in front of the computer and started analyzing the error logs, trying to figure out the issue. But I quickly realized this wasn't a typical technical problem. Among the company's files, there were folders I had never seen before. Folders with strange names, symbols that looked more like codes or formulas. Something inside me told me to stop, to not open those folders. But driven by curiosity, or maybe by the fear of the unknown, I clicked on one. What appeared on the screen was enough to make my blood run cold. Inside these folders, I found incredibly disturbing documents, fraudulent contracts, illegal transactions, and confidential information revealing that the company was involved in something very, very dark. Each document I opened pulled me deeper into an abyss of endless dark secrets. My stomach turned, and the feeling of imminent danger grew with each click. Suddenly, I heard a sound in the hallway. A low noise, like someone dragging something across the floor. My heart raced, and my breathing became heavy. I knew I wasn't alone. I slowly turned, expecting to see something on the other side of the door, but there was nothing, at least, nothing visible. The sound stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I tried to ignore the growing fear and refocused on the computer. I needed to understand what was going on. I kept digging, opening more and more folders, until I found a video. The video showed the office, but it seemed to be filmed from a strange angle, as if it were from a surveillance camera I didn't know existed. The room was empty, except for a shadow in the background, motionless. At first, I thought it was just a video glitch, but then the shadow started to move slowly, approaching the camera. Each step made me more nervous, and then suddenly it stopped. And then, something terrifying happened. The shadow looked directly at the camera. My eyes widened. This wasn't a glitch. This was real. I was about to shut down the computer and run when my phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. "You've gone too far, Johan. Stop now, or it will be too late." My entire body went cold. Who could be sending this? How did they know what I was doing? I looked toward the hallway, but everything was still. The silence was unbearable, but deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. I tried to stand up, but something stopped me. In the corner of the computer screen, a chat window appeared. A new message. "You cannot escape." Before I could react, the hallway lights began to flicker. The hum of the monitor grew louder, becoming almost deafening. Panic gripped me. It was as if the entire building was closing in on me, trapping me there. I ran toward the window. The only way out I saw was through it. With trembling hands, I managed to open the window, feeling the cold night air hit my face. I didn't think twice. I threw myself out, landing hard on the ground below. The pain shot through my legs, but I barely felt it. All I wanted was to get away from that cursed place. As I moved away from the building, I looked back. The lights in the windows continued to flicker, as if something inside was trying to call me back. But I wasn't going back. Not ever. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what happened that night. I tried to tell a few people, but they laughed, thinking I was just exhausted. The truth is, I still can't sleep properly. Every night, before I close my eyes, I feel like I'm still being watched. I receive strange messages on my phone, from unknown numbers, sending cryptic phrases like "we are still here" or "you know too much." I deleted all the files, but what I found that night will never leave me. I know there's something much bigger, something that was never meant to be uncovered. I should have stopped when I had the chance, but now, I'm trapped in this nightmare. And I know that someday, I'll have to face it again. What haunts me most, in the end, isn't what I saw. It's what I couldn't see. Story 6. My name is Klaus, and I work as a 911 operator in a small town in the German countryside. I always thought my job was predictable, answering calls from panicked people, dispatching ambulances, firefighters, or simply offering advice in moments of despair. I was never the type to believe in the supernatural. That was, until that night. Until the calls started. It all began one early morning, around 3 a.m. The clock on the wall seemed to echo in the silence of the control room. The night shift was usually quiet, with few emergencies. I was alone in the office, the monitors flickering their blue lights, when the phone rang. Emergency dispatch, Klaus speaking. What's your emergency? At first, there was no response. Just an unsettling silence on the other end. I repeated the question, growing a bit impatient. Then I heard something. A low whisper, almost unintelligible. I shivered. The voice was distorted, almost inhuman, and before I could make out what was being said, it mentioned my name. Klaus. I know what you did. I know your secrets. A chill ran down my spine. Who was this? How did they know my name? Before I could respond, the call was cut off. I immediately tried to trace the call, but to my surprise and horror, there was no record of it in the system. It was as if the call had never existed. I tried to rationalize what had happened, thinking it might have been a technical glitch, a mistake. But something about that voice deeply unsettled me. The following nights turned into a psychological torment. Every night, almost at the same time, the phone rang. Always the same pattern. A long silence, followed by that threatening whisper. And with each call, the voice revealed something personal, something only I knew. Dark secrets, things I had buried deep in my memory. Small mistakes from the past that I preferred to forget, but now they were being brought back, as if the person on the other end knew everything about me. I began losing sleep. Days and nights were spent in torment, waiting for that call. A sense of dread overtook me every time the phone rang, but I couldn't ignore it. I needed to know who was behind this. I needed answers. I decided to investigate. I spent hours reviewing the call logs, trying to find any pattern, any clue that could lead me to the culprit. But it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. The calls didn't exist in the system. There were no records, no origin, as if they were made from a place that didn't belong to this world. One of those early mornings, after a particularly disturbing call, where the voice whispered details of a betrayal from years ago, something I had never told anyone, I finally snapped. I stormed out of the emergency center, my heart racing, determined to confront whoever was tormenting me. The streets were deserted and dimly lit. A thin fog covered the town, and the only sound I could hear was the echo of my own footsteps in the silence. I followed the direction where, in a delirium, I thought the call might have come from. My instincts, or perhaps pure desperation, led me to a dark, dimly lit alley at the end of a street I rarely visited. And then I saw him. At the end of the alley, a figure stood motionless. It was a tall man, wearing a dark coat that seemed to swallow the light around him. His face was hidden in the shadows, but his eyes glowed in a way I can never describe. Somehow, I knew it was him. He was the source of the calls. He was the reason for my torment. Klaus, you finally came. The voice was the same. That cold whisper that had haunted me for so many nights. Who are you? What do you want from me? My voice trembled, almost a whimper of desperation. The man laughed. A low, cutting laugh that made the air around me feel heavier. I am what you try to forget. I am the secrets you buried. Each word felt like a blow. He knew. He knew everything. Memories of all my sins flooded back. Every mistake, every lie, the people I had hurt. And now it was all there before me, in the form of a shadowy figure at the end of an alley. You can't run from me. He took a step toward me. I wanted to run, but my body was frozen with terror. Do you remember that night, Klaus? The night when everything changed. My blood ran cold. I knew what he was talking about. There was a specific night in my past, something I had done, something I had tried to forget, something that should have stayed buried forever. But he knew. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my pocket. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and saw a message. I am with you. I will always be. It was from the same unknown number. I looked up, but the man at the end of the alley had disappeared. Silence returned, but the feeling that I was being watched never left. I felt that something had changed inside me, as if I was trapped in an invisible snare from which I could never escape. I returned to the emergency center, trying to appear normal, trying to continue my routine, but the fear never left me. The calls never stopped. Every night, the phone rings, and the whispering voice reminds me of my sins, of the lies, of the past I could never truly bury. Now, I live with this weight. Every time the phone rings, I know it's him. He's there lurking, waiting for me to give in to the fear, waiting for me to make one more mistake. And the truth is, I know I'll never escape. The whisper will always be with me, like a shadow, a reminder that some secrets can never be forgotten. And me? I'm condemned to live with this terror, knowing that the past will always find me, no matter where I try to hide. Story 7. My name is John, and I've been working as a night guard in a forest park in the Colorado mountains for over a decade. During the day, this park is a paradise for tourists and families. It's a beautiful, serene place where children run, couples have picnics, and hikers explore the many trails between the towering trees. But at night, everything changes. Darkness takes over, and the park transforms into something few know, something much more sinister and disturbing. At first, the night shift seemed peaceful, almost monotonous. Just me, the moon, and the sounds of nature. But over time, I realized there was something different in the air after the sun set. The sounds of the forest, which by day were just birds and the wind through the leaves, seemed to shift. It was as if, at night, the forest had a life of its own, something I couldn't see but could feel. One night, while on my usual patrol, I felt something strange in the air. The moon was especially pale, and the forest quieter than usual. There was no wind, and not even the sound of nocturnal animals. It was as if the park itself was holding its breath. I walked slowly along the trail, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead of me, but the shadows seemed denser closer. The feeling of being watched followed me with every step. As I approached an isolated area where the park became denser and the trees blocked even the moonlight, I heard something that made me stop. It wasn't a natural sound, nothing like what I was used to. It was a whisper, almost inaudible, but definitely coming from the depths of the forest. My first reaction was to ignore it. It must be the wind passing through the branches, I thought, trying to convince myself. But something inside me knew that wasn't the case. I kept walking, but the whisper didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to be getting louder, closer. My heart began to race, and a chill ran down my spine. I stopped again, pointing my flashlight in all directions. Nothing. No movement. But the whisper was still there, around me, almost as if it was inside my head. That's when I saw it for the first time. At the edge of my vision, between the trees, something moved. A shadow. Large, but fast. I turned the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing. Just the motionless trees and the darkness that seemed to grow. John, I heard my name whispered. It wasn't possible. No one knew I was there, and there was no one around. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the long, lonely nights were finally messing with my mind. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to finish my patrol faster than usual. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. With every step, it felt like something or someone was following me, hidden in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I kept walking, forcing myself to stay calm, but the forest seemed alive, and the darkness around me seemed like it wanted to swallow me whole. Finally, I reached the clearing, one of the most isolated spots in the park. During the day, that place used to be my refuge, a quiet space where I could relax for a brief moment. The sky was open, with no tree canopies blocking the stars, and the air was pure, filled with the scents of the forest. But that night, something was deeply wrong. As soon as I stepped into the clearing, a wave of cold ran down my spine. The air, which was usually cool and welcoming, was freezing, biting, as if even the wind had shrunk in fear. My heart began to race faster, and the flashlight in my hand seemed to tremble along with me. When the light illuminated the center of the clearing, my eyes were immediately drawn to the ground. There, carved into the damp earth, were symbols I had never seen before. They were circular marks, intricately drawn, almost as if they were part of an ancient ritual. The most disturbing part was that they looked fresh, as if someone or something had passed through just before I arrived. The ground around the symbols was strangely clean, with no fallen leaves or debris, as if that space had been protected from the forest itself. The whispers I had been hearing since the start of my patrol were now louder, clearer. They were no longer just suggestions on the wind. No, they were saying my name. Repeatedly. John. John. The sound was sweet, but there was something deeply wrong in the way my own voice seemed to echo back to me, distorted, deformed. Fear rose in my throat like poison, paralyzing me for a moment. I needed to leave, but my feet refused to obey. It was as if the ground was holding me, keeping me in that marked circle. The clearing, once so familiar, now felt hostile, almost alive. The shadows of the surrounding trees seemed to stretch, to bend toward me, like invisible hands reaching out. The silence between the whispers was palpable, crushing, and my body responded with a surge of adrenaline that seemed to have nowhere to go. I was trapped in that marked piece of earth. And then I saw it. On the other side of the clearing, something began to emerge from the shadows. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but soon it became clear that it wasn't. A tall figure, hooded, covered by a cloak so black it seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, was moving slowly toward me. Its steps made no sound, and yet I could feel its presence, an overwhelming force pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Its eyes, two red, malevolent orbs, glowed for a moment through the hood. They were like embers in the dark, pulsing with a silent rage. The figure didn't need to say anything for me to understand what was happening. I wasn't welcome there. I was an intruder, and that place, that clearing, was not meant for me. Something ancient, something evil, had risen from the depths of the forest, and I, through my own recklessness, had awakened it. I tried to scream. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was as if the air around me had been sucked away, and my voice, suffocated by the presence of that thing, was just a whisper compared to the terror unfolding before me. My body, frozen in place, wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch, helpless, as the figure moved closer, slow and relentless. Its eyes never left mine, burning with an intensity that made my heart race even faster. Then, I heard the voice. No longer whispers, but a deep, grave voice that seemed to resonate inside my own head. "You shouldn't be here." The words reverberated through my body like distant thunder, and suddenly, the fear became tangible, almost physical. With one final desperate effort, I finally managed to move my feet. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs would allow, but the shadows of the forest seemed to close in around me, like a suffocating curtain of darkness. My flashlight dropped to the ground at some point, instantly going out, leaving me completely blind. The only thing I could hear was my hurried footsteps, and behind me, the breathing of that figure, so close I could feel the icy chill on my neck. I stumbled several times, my knees and hands hitting the hard dirt ground. The pain reminded me that I was still alive, that I could still fight, but the presence behind me never retreated. Every time I fell, it seemed to get closer, as if it was playing with me, prolonging the terror for as long as possible before reaching me. Finally, the ranger station appeared in the distance, a solitary spot of light in the middle of the suffocating darkness. I ran as if my life depended on it, and perhaps it did. When I reached the safety of the station, I turned, expecting to see the figure emerge from the shadows, ready to drag me back into the abyss it had come from. But there was nothing. Just the forest, dark and quiet, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a nightmare. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But deep down, I knew there was no rational explanation. That figure, those symbols, the whispers, it was all real. And somehow, I knew it was still waiting for me in the darkness. I went home that night, but the terror didn't stay in the park. It followed me, silent, invisible, but present. Since then, every night, when the silence of the early morning falls, I hear the whispers again. They call to me, saying my name, and I know deep in my soul that one day I'll have to return to that clearing. One day, I may not be able to escape. Story 8. My name is Josh, and I'm the night operator at an old textile factory deep in rural Ohio. A place that, in the past, buzzed with life, with the sound of machines running at full speed, hurried workers, and the smell of freshly processed fabric in the air. Today, this place is just a shadow of what it once was. The walls are stained with rust, and the silence. Oh, the silence is almost unbearable. But it's my job to watch over this sleeping giant every night. The thing is, some things don't stay asleep forever. It all started about 6 months ago when they handed me the keys to the place. They said it would be easy, just a formality. The building's been shut down for years. No one goes there except maybe a few curious teenagers. Those were my boss's words, with a mocking grin on his face. Oh, how wrong he was. On my first night, the air felt heavy. I'm not talking about heat or humidity, but a feeling, like something or someone was watching me with every step I took. The hallways were long, and the fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting shadows that danced on the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, who would believe an old factory could have something sinister about it? For weeks, I walked those halls without much trouble, but there was one night I will never forget. It was around 2 in the morning. The wall clock in the control room ticked loudly, almost annoyingly. With each movement of the hand, it felt like time was dragging. I was sitting there when I heard a sound. A faint scraping, like bare feet dragging across the concrete floor. I looked at the cameras, but everything seemed normal. The shadows were where they should be, the silence absolute, except for that sound, which now seemed closer. I decided to get up and take a walk. After all, it was my job. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out the door. The sound vanished as soon as I left the room, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I walked through the corridors, passing by the massive abandoned machines, feeling the presence of something behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing. Then, in the farthest hallway near the old boiler room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The corridor was swallowed in oppressive darkness, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow your soul. My boots echoed heavily on the concrete floor, and that's when I saw him. An old man, tall, with disheveled gray hair, stood in the middle of the hallway. The faint flicker of a light illuminated only part of his face, but enough for me to realize something was terribly wrong. His eyes. They had no life, like two black voids, empty, sucking all the light and warmth from the room. He stared at me, but not in a normal way. It was as if he were looking through me, or worse, at something I couldn't see. He wore clothes that seemed pulled straight out of the 1950s, a worn flannel shirt and wide, oil-stained pants. His clothes, like him, seemed trapped in time, like an old photograph forgotten for decades. His lips trembled uncontrollably, and he muttered words that made no sense, words that sounded like a dead language, something ancient and cursed. "Who the hell are you?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the empty halls, but he didn't respond. He just kept whispering into the void, as if he were having a conversation with someone, or something that only he could see. The sound of his voice, low and guttural, seemed to come from a deep place, a place where shadows live. The sense that there was something more in that hallway grew with every second, an invisible presence crawling along the walls and lurking in the shadows. My heart pounded as if it were trying to escape my chest. I knew I needed to get out of there, but it felt like my feet were rooted to the floor. Slowly, I backed away, sweat running down my face as my eyes stayed fixed on that figure, which now seemed to be floating slightly, his feet barely touching the ground. The flashlight in my hand began to flicker frantically, as if the very electricity was being drained by the presence of the old man. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, every fiber of my being in full panic. I locked myself in the control room, my hands trembling as I tried to grab the radio to call my supervisor. But when I put the headset on, all I heard was static, disturbing, and endless. It was a horrible sound, like someone was blowing from deep within a tomb. The old man was still there on the security camera, standing in the exact same spot, but now his eyes were locked directly on the lens. He knew I was watching. And then, without warning, he disappeared. It wasn't like in a typical horror movie, where figures slowly fade into the shadows. He vanished all at once, like he had never been there. 1 second he was on camera, and the next, he simply didn't exist. The room around me felt suffocating, and the sound of bare feet scraping against the concrete floor returned, but this time it was louder, faster, as if it were running straight toward me. Each step made the panic inside me swell, the sound echoing like thunder in my head. I was trapped, with no way out. Then, silence. A deep, crushing silence filled the place, broken only by the soft creak of the control room door slowly opening. There was no wind, but it moved on its own, and the light from my flashlight began to flicker again, each flicker revealing something horrifying. At the edge of the door, the old man stood there. He hadn't disappeared. His empty eyes watched me through the crack, as if he were studying my every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. What happened next is a blur. My entire body froze, unable to react, trapped in a terror so deep it made me forget how to breathe. That old man was less than a meter from me, but there was no sound. Just that hellish silence. When I finally regained some control, the old man disappeared once again, leaving no trace, no sound, as if he had been nothing more than a part of the void itself. But the air didn't get any lighter. He was still there, somewhere. The feeling of being watched, hunted, was as real as the concrete beneath my feet. I fled the factory that night, and to this day when I close my eyes, I still see Samuel's empty eyes staring at me, waiting, always waiting. So, do you think you'd have the courage to face what still haunts me to this day? I doubt it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like to support us. And more importantly, if you've had any supernatural experiences, don't keep them to yourself. Write your story in the comments below. Share your encounter with the unexplained, feed the collective curiosity, and who knows, maybe together we can uncover these mysteries that hang like mist between the world of the living and the dead. Remember, the unknown is always lurking, just one story away. And now, with night falling, who knows what shadows might emerge from the darkness to whisper yet another true horror story.